from slaves to sons. Galatians chapter 3 verse 27 to chapter 4 verse 7. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There's neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither slave nor free. There's no male and female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise. I mean that the heir, as long as he's a child, is no different from a slave, though he's the owner of everything. But he's under guardians and managers until the date set by his father. In the same way, we also, when we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you're no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. This passage continues the theme that we looked at last week in chapter 3 of Galatians, that we move from a life based on principles to a life based on the promises of God. Let's dive in on chapter 3, verse 27. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. Baptism means to be dipped. In this case, to be dipped into Christ. Some people are baptized as children in the confidence that as they go through their life, they will be following Jesus. Others are baptized as adults, once they've made a decision, perhaps, to follow Jesus Christ. And others, in the very act of being baptized, are making that decision to follow Jesus Christ. But in all cases, the result is that those who are baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There's been a permanent change in their being, to where now they're covered with Christ, filled with Christ. They are in Christ. And because those who are baptized are in Christ, they share in the inheritance that Christ has from God the Father. And that's what Paul is focusing on here. Hence the next verse, 28. There's neither Jew nor Greek. There's neither slave nor free. There's no male and female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. It's important to see this verse in its context, or it can sound very bizarre. It's saying that those who are in Christ Jesus are one, sharing the same inheritance, whether they're Jew or Greek, i.e. religious or non-religious, whether they're slave or free, whether they're male or female, they all share the same inheritance. Verse 29, and if you are Christ's, then you're Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise. If you belong to Christ, if you're baptized in Christ, then you are an inheritor according to God's promises, just like Abraham inherited God's promises. And what is the promise? Well, if you really boil it down, the promise is God himself. You inherit God. Let's go on to chapter 4, verse 1. I mean that the heir, as long as he's a child, is no different from a slave, though he's the owner of everything. And what we find Paul doing here is basically restating what he stated in Galatians chapter 3, verses 23 to 26. That, again, we move through a process from living on the basis of principles of the law to living on the basis of the promises of God as sons of God. And like any good teacher, Paul repeats the same point several times in different ways. So here's his first repetition of that point. Let's read it again. I mean that the heir, as long as he's a child, is no different from a slave, though he's the owner of everything. Verse 2, but he's under guardians and managers until the date set by his father. So you have to picture a child who is due to inherit from their father. But while they're a child, they can't have that inheritance. They're not ready for it, even though technically they own everything that they're going to inherit. For a time, they have to be trained, taught. They're not ready to inherit. They're not mature enough, not old enough. And the father sets a date at which that child is going to receive the inheritance and be able to start making use of it. And meanwhile, this child is under, here it says, guardians and managers. In this case, principles of the law. that help to prepare us to live as mature sons of God. And that's the meaning of what Paul is speaking about here, that there's a period of time where we are technically the inheritors of God, but we need the law in order to help to train and teach us and bring us to the place where we're ready to make use of God, so to speak, in our lives. And when we look at this phrase, guardians and managers, it means stewards or overseers, or in the Greek, house distributors. So you picture someone who's in charge of the resources within a home and who distributes them as they see fit in an appropriate way at an appropriate time. And that's what it's like to live with the law of God, to live under the law of God, that there are principles that we live by which dictate to us when we can benefit from and partake in certain aspects of life and when we can't. And as I gave a very simplistic example in the last talk on Galatians, you have a young child who is being taught through rules and instructions how to eat healthily. So the rule in the home, for example, is you can't have ice cream unless you have meat and vegetables first. So for a time, that child is under that law. That law is like a guardian or manager that's distributing food to that child in an appropriate way at appropriate times. And so the child learns that they need to take into their body more than just sugar. Now, obviously, the point will come when that child is mature enough to not need a rule in their life saying that they must eat meat and vegetables as well as ice cream, because it's just become innate to them. And so there comes a point of maturity where that child knows what's good for it and can make its own decisions, might decide not to have any ice cream one day, or one day might decide to have 2 bowls of it after meat and veg, or even just go for an ice cream on their own. But they're able to make those decisions. They're mature. That inheritance of freedom to decide what to eat and when, they're ready for it, and so it's theirs now. So repeating those 2 verses, I mean that the heir, as long as he's a child, is no different from a slave, though he's the owner of everything. But he's under guardians and managers until the date set by his father. So the idea here as well is that a slave doesn't have the freedom to just partake in all the benefits of the household, whereas a son, as we'll see, does. Reading on, chapter 4, verse 3, Paul reiterates for the second time this principle of passing from principles to promises. In the same way, we also, when we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. So, when we were children, we were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. This word children in the Greek means people who are unskilled or untaught. It doesn't have to be someone who's young in years. It can be even an adult that's just not been taught, that's unskilled, unaware of how things should be done, and so they're learning. So when we were unskilled, when we were untaught, then we were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. This word enslaved means to be held in bondage to something. And elementary principles of the world means the basic principles or the first principles of the cosmos. In other words, the basic facts about reality and how it works. So summing up, when we were unskilled, when we were untaught, then we were held in bondage to, held closely captive by the basic principles of the universe. Now, the basic principles of the universe, the way things actually work, obviously isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing. In other words, when we're young in terms of maturity, what's being worked into us is the basic principles of how things work in reality, the basic principles of the cosmos. But we're so tied into those principles in terms of how we live that we don't have a whole lot of freedom to determine what we do and what we don't do. Moving on, verse 4, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. So there's a movement that happens from living under the law, living in bondage to the basic principles of the universe, to living as sons. And how does this happen? Well, what we've just read says that when the right time had come, when the fullness of time had come, in other words, when everything had been prepared and was made ready, then God sent a new actor, so to speak, into the picture, his own Son. And his Son came as a human being, born of woman, and his Son came born under the law, as someone who had to live by the basic principles of the universe, someone who had to have instructions and rules and regulations when they were young and unskilled and untaught. So he was born of woman, born under the law. Why did he come? So that then he could redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. God's Son came. He came under the law. He came as a human being like you or I, with the purpose that then he would redeem us from living under the law so that we could live as sons. Now, this word redeem means to buy us back from the law, or to buy something for himself. So Jesus Christ, through his life and death, he bought us back. He paid for us, if you like, to be brought out from under the guardianship of the law in order that we could be his, belong to him, be his brothers, and share the inheritance of the same Father. So in summary of those two verses, we were living as slaves to the law, to the basic principles of the universe, to the rules and regulations that exist in order to keep us in check and teach us how to love, how to live life rightly. That was the life of principles. But there was a goal in mind for that. We weren't supposed to stay in that place. So where we were supposed to end up was being sons who are regarded and treated as being mature and able to handle life without needing to be under the guardianship of those principles and those laws. And so God, in order to move us from slavery to sonship, he sent his own Son, who came and lived in this world as a human being, lived under the law, but in actually fulfilling the law and then dying for us, he redeemed us from needing to live under the law so that we could, along with him, be sons of God. And we're told that this all was done so we might receive adoption as sons. And a quick word on that. Obviously, in our modern culture, we think of adoption only in terms of a child typically being brought into a family that's not their biological family because they have nowhere else to live. But in the context in which Paul was writing, adoption also referred to a son, a biological son, coming to the place of maturity where they could receive the inheritance that their father had for them. So let's go on now to the next verse, verse 6. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So we have become sons of God through Jesus Christ, and therefore God has sent the Spirit of his Son, of Jesus, into our hearts, and the Spirit of his Son relates to God as Father. This word Abba is the Hebrew word for father. It's a word used by both children and mature adults. It encompasses everything that you would hope to see in a relationship between a son and their father, i.e., affection, respect, mutual dialogue and communication. It's a very rich term. And it's powerful that here we're told that the Spirit we've been given enables us to relate to God as our Father. Maybe for you, from your own experience, your relationship with your Father may have not had much affection in it. So you can be sure that the relationship that you've been given with God, your Father, includes affection. Or maybe in your relationship with your Father, you didn't have much respect for him, or he didn't have much respect for you. You can be sure that in your relationship with God as your Father, you have respect for him. He's worthy of that respect. And he, in the right sense of understanding this, he respects you. He treats you with dignity and with honor. Maybe in your relationship with your Father, you've experienced both respect and affection. And that's great because that gives you a bridge into understanding what it is to be able to call God Abba, Father, as well. Verse 7, so you're no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. And this is where the whole passage from 3:23 to 4:7 has been leading up to. You're no longer a slave, you're a son, and if you're a son, then you're an heir through God. When it says you're no longer a slave, this is referring very, very specifically to the fact that you're no longer under bondage to the law, but instead, you are a son of God. So you don't need to live based purely on principles, but you live based on the promises of God, which are that you are his son and he's with you and he's leading and guiding you, and you have the freedom to walk with him and decide the path you take based on confidence in his leading. So, in order to wrap this up, I want to point out that there's two levels really that you can see this passage on. One of them is quite cosmic. It's describing what God has done with humanity in moving humanity from a place of needing to be living by principles and laws into living as sons of God. And that's certainly one of the perspectives on this passage, that you can read the Bible from beginning to end and you see a progress of how God's dealing with humanity. And part of that process, especially in the Old Testament, was the arrival of the law. And that was leading up to the arrival of Christ, so that then human beings could understand what it is to be sons of God. So it can be interpreted on a very cosmic level, let's say, and it can be also interpreted on a very personal level. And on the personal level, it can be interpreted in two ways. The first way is that this has already been done for you. If you're in Christ, if you've been baptized into Christ, then you are no longer under the guardianship of the law. You are a son of God, and you're learning to live with that, in that reality. And that's true. That is your identity. That's the real you. You're a son and not a slave to the law. However, you can also interpret it on the personal level, in the sense that in different areas of our lives, we may still need the guardianship of the law. For example, if you've been addicted to something, you may have been a Christian for some time, but you may have struggled with a particular addiction. And it may well be that in order to bring you to the place of maturity where you're free, completely free from that addiction, you need to have a period of time where you are under the law, where there are rules about how you behave and what you do and where you go or don't go. And that's all with the goal that the point is coming where you're not going to need those rules. So the truth is that who we are in God is that we are no longer under the guardianship of the law, but we sometimes need to experience the law in our lives precisely in order to bring us to live according to who we've already become, which is sons and not slaves. So the wonderful message of this passage is that we've moved from being slaves to the law to sons. We've moved from needing to live on the basis of and dictated to by rules and regulations and principles, good as they may be. We've moved from that into being able to live as sons of God, where we've inherited God. He's with us, he's for us, he's guiding us, he's leading us, and we're very, very, very free in him. I want to ask you to pray to God in two areas. I want to ask you to pray and ask him if you are still living under the guardianship of the law in any area of your life. And if the answer is yes, if you realize that you are, I then want you to ask him if you need to be living under the guardianship of the law in that area of your life. It may be that the answer is yes, that there's an area of your life, as I alluded to earlier, where you need those principles and rules in place to help guide you into the right kind of maturity, in which case, carry on with that and be grateful for it. Remember that there's a goal to this, and the goal is the day when you're not going to need those rules and principles. It may also, though, be that you realize that you don't need to be under the guardianship of the law in that area, that you sense the Lord is saying to you that you're mature enough to not need that now, in which case, leave it behind. Leave behind your structure that's kept you safe and secure, and step forward into the freedom of being a son of God. Trust him, trust yourself, and in that particular area, start simply living as a son of God in the joy and freedom of that. So once again, please pray and ask if you're under the guardianship of the law in any area, and if you realize that you are, ask whether you need to be or not, If you do need to be, then continue. If you don't need to be, then it's time to be bold and step forward in freedom. God bless you, and remember, you are an inheritor of God. It's all yours. I'm going to finish by reading one verse from another book in the Bible, from another of Paul's letters. This is from 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 21 and 22. For all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all are yours. And you are Christ's, and Christ is God's. God bless you. Until next time.